Greetings, Marklar. I'm Marklar. I'm a Marklar at Marklar, here to talk to you about how you can make your Marklar more Marklar. At this point, you're probably saying to yourself, what the Marklar is she talking about? Well, this has been an exercise in semantics, because if we use the same word for everything, it has no meaning. It would be the same word over and over again, which would be useless. So, especially to people who can't see visual designs, it's really important that we add meaning to our words. Here's a code example. Let me zoom in a little bit. And actually, given what we're going to talk about today, this isn't that far-fetched. I have a Marklar tag. It has a nested Marklar tag, some text. It has a Marklar that looks like a link, but it's kind of doesn't really tell you what it's for. If we created our web components without semantics, we run the risk of adding a lot of soulless div tags around the web, and nobody needs that. So you're here to hear about the accessibility of web components. Who am I? I am Marcy Sutton. I am a developer at Substantial in Seattle, which is a 60-ish person development studio. And we do design and development. But I work there because they allow me to expand my skill set beyond just the front end. But I am stronger at the front end. So along with the projects I work on, I really focus on making them accessible. And recently, that's included a fitness app for personal trainers and a whiskey recommendations app, because everybody wants to drink whiskey, right? So why shouldn't we make all of those things accessible? I love accessibility because it adds meaning to my work. It makes the everyday grind a lot more enjoyable. It's the right thing to do. And also, accessibility can provide some really freaking cool development opportunities. It is not boring, as I tried to convince Dominic, but he's not sold quite yet. So, some accessibility challenges that are worth going over real quick to refresh our memory. Semantics is a huge thing in accessibility that I'm going to talk a lot about today in the context of web components. So the type of element that we create, it becomes an object, and that type of object matters to somebody who can't see it. For keyboard access, this is actually a wider audience than just people using screen readers. This affects a lot of people. How many of you have ever broken your arm? How many of you have run out of batteries in your mouse? Yeah, that's a lot of you, right? So you want to use your keyboard, but we are accustomed to it really sucking out there. Keyboard access is a huge problem, and we're used to being able to give up and use the mouse. But if you couldn't use a mouse because you had poor motor control or you're using some sort of assistive technology, you rely on that keyboard. So it's really important that we build that into all of our websites, but I'm going to focus a lot on web components because it's more fun to talk about. Also, in accessibility challenges, text alternatives are really important. So that includes the alt attributes on your images, form labels or their Aria equivalents, and off-screen text, which I use a lot to add text to my documents when it's not represented in a visual design. I can put headings or other text off screen to give users who are non-visual users some context of a document, and that actually rounds out the whole HTML hierarchy in my document, but I don't leave it out because it wasn't in a visual design. Saying it wasn't in the design is not a good enough excuse. We need text alternatives. And another part of accessibility challenges is color contrast. And this starts with your brand guide. So you want to work with a designer to make sure that the colors in your brand and on your web pages meet the color contrast ratios so that people can see your content. Web components. You're probably hearing lot about them these days, and for good reason, because it's sort of a revolution for us as front-end developers. There's 5 major parts to web components, which are standards moving through the W3C and into modern browsers right now. Custom elements, which we'll talk about today, ShadowDOM, templates, HTML imports, which are super cool because you can include a snippet of HTML just like a style sheet in a link tag. And then decorators, which actually don't have a spec yet, as far as I know. But the idea with decorators is that you could include a snippet of HTML in your CSS, just like you would include a background image, except you're including HTML, and that will then decorate your HTML for presentation purposes. So that's really exciting. I'm curious to see where decorators go. Today, we're going to talk about web components. We're going to focus on ShadowDOM and what happens in a screen reader, because that's what I was really curious about. And then we'll talk about custom elements and how we need to add semantics to those elements. Why are we excited? I mean, maybe you have your own reasons, but I'm excited about web components because it's a chance to extend the DOM. And we have a lot of power with that. That's exciting. We aren't waiting for browser implementers to give us new elements, like the HTML5 form inputs. There's some really cool stuff there, but it takes a long time for those standards to roll out, and they vary across browsers. So we have been granted this power to create new elements, but we need to make sure they're accessible. So I'll tell you about how we can make our elements accessible and what we get for free. And then lastly, we can minimize conflicts by encapsulating part of our HTML. And that's where ShadowDOM comes in. So ShadowDOM is spooky sounding, but the idea is that you're encapsulating a DOM subtree under a shadow root. And there's some terms that we should talk about here. Shadow host is the element that you're actually inserting your ShadowDOM into. If you think about the HTML5 video tag and how you only have to drop in a video tag, but along with that comes all of the controls, the little volume slider, there's a playback slider. You don't have to actually implement each of those pieces. You get those as part of this component. So the shadow host is the video tag that's in your regular DOM. A shadow tree is the node tree that gets inserted into that shadow DOM. So all of those parts in the video tag are a shadow tree. And then the shadow root is the root node of the shadow tree, and that's actually behind an encapsulation boundary. So trees. And I learned a lot more about trees as I did some of this research. They exist in other parts of computer science. They resemble nature. There's some characteristics of trees that I find really interesting. There's a root value. There are subtrees with children, and it's a representation of a set of linked nodes. You can see that the end of the tree branches don't circle back and reach each other. So it's just interesting to compare trees in other languages with the DOM. We don't really think of it as a linked list or a DOM or a tree data structure, but it is. So taking that concept and actually looking at the ShadowDOM, I have an image here from the W3C ShadowDOM spec. And we can see the regular DOM on the left, and it has our shadow host in the document tree. And then on the right, we have a representation of a ShadowDOM subtree. And the line in between is illustrating that there's actually a boundary. And this boundary, I was really curious what would happen in a screen reader, because you have scripts and styles that don't cross that boundary, but what happens to a screen reader or any other kind of assistive technology like a screen magnifier? And as it turns out, actually, the screen reader can get past that boundary, but I wanted to know why. Like, it was surprisingly easy. Once I went and tested it, it just worked. But I really wanted to learn why, so I dug in more and found out some interesting stuff. I actually went and looked a lot at how browsers work. And if you're curious about this, there's a really good article from HTML5 Rocks called How Browsers Work. And on the screen right now, I have a screenshot of the WebKit rendering engine flow. It's pretty simplified because browsers are actually some of the most complex pieces of software. They clean up our messes. They fix our broken code. They render it anyway. It's actually really interesting. We give IE a lot of trouble, but they clean up a lot of really bad HTML and render it anyway. We kind of forget that because Chrome is really forgiving. But what is really interesting to look at here with this rendering flow is that you start off with your HTML. And you can see from this diagram, it parses your HTML. It tokenizes it. It creates objects out of your tags. And those objects have types. Those types are really important. Like in the case of a form, when a screen reader encounters, it changes modes. And it gives the user a different set of options for interacting with it. So if you just had a bunch of DOM elements or div elements, and you wanted it to actually act like a form, that's why we use input elements, is because a screen reader will be told what to do with the element. Let's see, what else? So another thing to mention is that the objects in this rendering process are affected by JavaScript and CSS. So in the rendering process, we affect our DOM tree with JavaScript. We can append elements, we can hide them with CSS, and that affects the actual tree. So elements that are hidden with display none in CSS don't get rendered, and therefore they don't have accessibility objects. So they're kept out of a screen reader. That's how when you're, say for example, you had a hover menu, and you wanted to keep all of the content when it's closed from actually getting read in a screen reader, because if you can't see it with your eyes, you shouldn't force a screen reader or a keyboard through it. So to hide that from a screen reader, we add display none. And the effect that that has is that it doesn't paint it, and it doesn't add an object to the accessibility tree. So all of these things, the CSS and JavaScript, they affect this rendering process. And what you get in the end is a tree. Why is this accessible? For ShadowDOM, it's accessible because the screen reader encounters the tree after rendering, and what they call as rendered. And I have a funny pun here with Bob Ross saying, let's paint a happy little tree, because that's what a screen reader gets. It gets the tree as rendered, and so therefore the ShadowDOM is actually accessible, which is a huge win. Super exciting. I didn't have to go beat up any browser implementers because these specs are developing and evolving, and I thought if there was a problem, we could go do something about it now. But I didn't have to, which is awesome. I could make friends instead of beating people up. So how do we ShadowDOM? It's pretty easy. I have a simple example here and some JavaScript. I'll step through each piece of this. We start with a template tag, which in the case of Internet Explorer, like older versions, you actually have to hide the template tag because they don't know what to do with it, so they render it. But the template tag is supposed to be an element that doesn't get rendered. It basically provides you a content sandbox that you can grab content and then inject it into your ShadowDOM. So to start, to create a web component, I need to create an element by using object.create, and then I have a generic HTML element here, and I grab its prototype, store it in a variable. And when I register this new element, I'm using a taco surprise element, which don't ask me what that is, but when we register this element, it has a callback function that we call, and in this created callback, we need to create a shadow root, which I mentioned earlier. The shadow root is the root node of a shadow tree, which is behind that encapsulation boundary. So to establish the encapsulation boundary, we create a shadow root. And then we clone our template into the shadow root. And then our element that we've created has encapsulation. And it has content because we're injecting it. This implementation expects there to be a tag in your DOM already named taco-surprise. And the deal with creating your own tags is that they have to have a dash in the middle. And that's sort of a prefix. The characters before the dash are a prefix. Maybe the W3C is going to make a taco surprise element at some point. I'm not really sure. So let's do a little demo, because this is where the really interesting stuff happens. I thought when I was creating an encapsulated web component, like what kind of component would I make? So I thought about a nuclear detonator, something where you have to actually change the state of it. And so we have this little nuclear detonator. It's like you have to flip the cap of it, and then you get the real button. So for this, and I'm going to turn on VoiceOver, which, how many of you are Mac users? Did you know that you all have a screen reader in your computer already? Yeah, awesome. How many of you have iPhones? You also have screen reader in your pocket. You can test your own stuff anytime. It's really cool. If you're a Windows user, you can get JAWS, which stands for Job Access with Speech. That's the most widely used screen reader. You can get it a free copy, a demo copy that lasts for 40 minutes at a time. So I encourage you to go and test with this stuff. I use VirtualBox and Windows VM just so that I can test it on my Mac all the time. And that stuff's all free. But I'm going to turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Explosion demo. ShadowDOM accessibility window. Explosion demo. ShadowDOM accessibility. HTML content as keyboard focus.
So I'm going to start tabbing in here.
0. Choose a percentage between 0 and 100 slider.
That went right into the ShadowDOM boundary. That is actually inside of my web
slider
component.
inside of HTML content. To start interacting with the slider, press Control, Option, Shift, down
I'm
arrow.
going to hit the arrow keys because I've wired this thing up to slide. I don't have to use the mouse. So I can move it, and it's actually changing the position of that little slider.
Yes, really group.
It's asking me if am I really sure? Do I really want to detonate this thing and cause explosion?
You are currently on a button inside of HTML content. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space.
I definitely really want to see what happens.
Developer tools. VoiceOver off.
Explosions. So I like goats. I think goats are really cool. And I do have explosions on the screen right now, but there's also an animated GIF of goats on this bendy piece of metal. And I want to be them. I think that looks really fun. And just a word, if you end up grabbing my slides, which I'll tweet in a little bit, you might not want to get this demo unless you're on a really good web connection, because that GIF is really big. Like, don't go look at it on your phone, because I want to preserve your data plan. So what we saw there was that I could use the keyboard and a screen reader to go right through that shadow boundary, and then I had enabled the component with the keyboard so that I could use it. And those are some of the components of accessibility that we need to think about. And it's regardless of whether it's going through a ShadowDOM boundary or into a custom element. We need semantics, we need keyboard access, and we need text alternatives. So on that element, I had Aria attributes that told me what the maximum value or the minimum and the maximum values were. And then as it slides, I update. So it's a percentage. I have 0 and 100%. And as I slide it with JavaScript, I can update the Aria value now property and tell you exactly where the slider is. And that gives a screen reader really like a lot of data. They actually know what to do with it even if they can't see it. So those are the things that we need to think about more when we create HTML. Current native support for ShadowDOM, it's not really out there yet, but right now you can use ShadowDOM in Chrome. In Opera, Firefox Nightly, I've heard. I actually had a little trouble getting that to work, so I want to play with that more. And then Chrome for Android. And I always check this stuff on caniuse.com. That's a really good place to go check support. For polyfills, there's Polymer and Xtag, and they both have a shim that you can drop in, and that'll round out support to evergreen browsers, and that means browsers that will update themselves. So for Polymer, they can get you back to IE10. Xtag can get you to IE9, but I think that's because they have a little bit less features in Xtag, and I heard that Xtag, they are possibly going to roll those features into Brick and do away with it. So this stuff is changing all the time. But both Polymer and Brick offer you web component libraries. I'm just using the shim so that I can build my own components, but then I can round out support to a few more browsers than just that list of 3 or 4. So custom elements. I think it would be really cool if we had a taco button. And again, I have a dash in there because the W3C might want to make a taco button at some point. The custom element basically means that, like the video tag, you could create your own elements. The sky's the limit, really. But we want to keep in mind those accessibility things that I mentioned earlier. So adding semantics to a native element. There's a couple different ways. The first way is that instead of creating the generic HTML element, the prototype, here we're creating an HTML button element. And along with that, my hope is that you would get some of the methods and default values that a button would get. Like if you have a button element that you just instantiate in your DOM, you can tab onto it. It'll fire events. If it's a submit button in a form, it would actually trigger the form. So that's behavior that you get. If you were actually creating an element that was supposed to do stuff like that, you need to add those methods or properties unless you're extending an existing element. So for creating a native element here, we grab the HTML button elements prototype, and then we register our element. And when we register it, the magic keyword here is the extends property, and we give it a string of whichever type of element we're creating. So I'm creating a button. And then I can append this thing to the page. I found that to get this behavior, you have to actually inject the element into the DOM. It doesn't seem to work if I have an existing tag in my DOM already and then I modify it with JavaScript. These you have to actually inject. So this is something I'm playing with more as time goes by. But theoretically, this is how you would do it, purely from the JavaScript side. Another approach to adding semantics is to use native child elements. And Polymer is a little guilty of this, or at least they were. All of their, or some of their examples, they would have a web component, and then inside of it, they would use a div for a heading. And that's just silly. You should use a heading for a heading, or use a button, or an anchor, or whatever your code is supposed to do. Use the native element, and then you get all of that behavior for free. And it really helps a screen reader. That's kind of the whole idea here. But here I'm using an H2 and a button, and then I have maybe a nested web component for some output. Maybe I'm going to load an image, and if that doesn't work, I can show a little error message. Here I say, give me tacos or give me death. If I had an error, I could make a funny error message. So another way to add semantics is to use Aria. And if you're not familiar with Aria, the goal of it, and it stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, the goal of Aria is actually to fill in gaps where HTML doesn't have behavior for what you need. So you can add a role to your HTML to make it behave like a button element or a tab panel or something, but you need all of the components. And I encourage you to go and read, for any of those roles that you're going to use, go read the information, the spec about it, because you might learn that it might be a little harder to implement than you thought, because there's expectations for the keyboard and that sort of thing. But for a button, it's pretty simple. If you could just use a regular button, that would be ideal. But to get my taco button to work, I gave it a role of button, and then I gave it a tab index so that I could actually tab onto it, because the role of button doesn't really give it tab index to put it in the tab order. So to actually make it keyboard accessible, I need tab index as well. And another example I have here is a slider, and I can add a role of slider. And I was thinking, slider, I kind of want a pork slider. So I made a pork slider web component, and I gave it some Aria values. I need at least one pork slider, so I have an Aria value min of 1. I can only eat maybe 5. That would be pushing it a little bit. So I have a Aria value max of 5. But right now I have 0 pork sliders, so I have a value now of 0. But as I get pork sliders, I could update that value. That would be cool. So this is totally contrived example, but I mean, slider, that's what you're going to think of from now on. So, which leads me to the ultimate web component. What if I could have tacos brought to me from the web? That would be amazing, right? Give me tacos. So I have this button. It's similar to my taco button I had earlier. It has tab index. I can turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Accessibility of web components window. Give me tacos. The ultimate web component ready for tacos.
I don't know why it reads all of that. It does. So if I refresh, because I loaded all my slides earlier, so I have a ready event that I want to
currently on the
play
button
aloud for
inside
you.
Of reload this page. Accessibility 90% loaded.
It was not playing all the time. VoiceOver is a little picky.
You are voiceover off.
Before I actually go through with this, I want to explain a concept of AriaLive Regions, and they're really cool. So basically the idea is that you have a div off screen somewhere on your page, and it has to be in the accessibility tree, so you can't use display none, but if you just position it like way off the screen, it'll still get rendered theoretically, but you just can't see it visually. So that's how you expose content to a screen reader, but you keep it out of the visual design. So I have this div off screen, and I give it an AriaLive attribute, and the property that I give it, in this case, I'm using polite, but there's also assertive. And so the idea of this thing is that it's a div that's like a message center, and you can append content into it, and since it's watching for it, basically, using AriaLive, anytime I inject content into this div, it'll read it through a screen reader. And they're pretty well supported. So I have AriaLive of polite here, because I don't need to be rude. But if I had an alert, like you were logging out or like some emergency, you could use assertive. So I'm going to interact with this component, and then it should give us some feedback through VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Accessibility of web components with link. Skip to navigation.
And I have
item.
a hacked version of Reveal that has accessibility features. If you want it, let me know, and I'll give it to you.
Give me tacos button.
All right, so.
Call pending. The ultimate web COMPONENT ready for tacos button.
So we have some tacos, but I have to go allow my microphone, because I'm going to make a phone call.
You are currently on a button inside of HTML content. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
So I should be calling somebody right now. Huh, it's pretty cool.
Whoa, this is the weirdest thing. Tacos. Why do I just really feel like tacos? Okay, this is weird. I've never done this before, but like,
Call
I need to
open.
do this.
The ultimate web COMPONENT call open button.
I just want more tacos. Oh, well, we made a phone call. That was pretty awesome. Tacos! Did you know that you can make a web component that brings you tacos? And it can be accessible because you can use AriaLive Regions, and it'll tell you when it's calling, so you don't have to like miss a beat. And Angelina Fabreau will bring you tacos. I mean, come on.
VoiceOver off.
So if you want a taco, come grab one.
Please use this power like just once in a while, because I got
All right. So quickly, custom element native support is not very wide yet. The stuff moves really fast. Camera. But you can check the website, Are We Componentized Yet, to see where it's at. That's the end. I want to thank Mozilla for bringing us tacos, and Angelina especially. I want to thank Carter from Twilio for hooking me up with that amazing phone functionality. And if you want to get more resources, I have a URL up on the screen right now. It's tiny.cc/A11y-web-components. And that has a link to my slides. They're also on GitHub. But thanks all for coming. That was a lot of fun. Woo!